Hey everyone, welcome back to LGBT Stories, where we dive into emotional, romantic, and sometimes heart-wrenching tales from the LGBT community. Today, we're bringing you a story that will tug at your heartstrings and leave you thinking. It's a tale of unexpected connections and the powerful pull of emotions that can't be ignored. Get ready for a story that will stay with you long after the video ends. Let's jump right in. 3 weeks ago, my nephew did something so unexpected to me behind the barn that it set my whole world upside down. It had been exciting, and I should have known from the moment I set foot on the farm that something was different. It happened 3 weeks ago. The air was thick with the scent of freshly cut hay and sun-warmed wood. But there was something else beneath it, something intangible that made my skin prickle. I had spent countless summers here, helping out with the animals and soaking in the peace of country life. But this time, everything felt charged. As I stepped out of my truck, stretching after the long drive, I spotted him near the barn, stacking bales of hay with practiced ease. My nephew, Alex, had been just a lanky teenager the last time I'd seen him, all awkward angles and restless energy. But now, standing shirtless under the midday sun, his lean body tanned and strong from years of farm work, he was a man, taller and broader. There was something in the way he looked at me that sent a flicker of unease through my chest. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his arm, dropped the bale he had been holding, and turned toward me. His gaze lingered, dark and unreadable, before his lips curled into a smirk. "Uncle Robert," he said, his voice deeper than I remembered. "Didn't think you'd make it so early." I forced a small smile, hoisting my bag over my shoulder. "Got an early start. Figured I'd beat the traffic." He nodded, stepping forward and closing the distance between us. "Dad and Mom left this morning," he said. "It's just us for the week." Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through me, though I couldn't quite place why. I had always been close with Alex, had watched him grow up, taught him how to ride horses, sat beside him on the porch on warm summer nights talking about life. But there was something different now, an awareness in his gaze that hadn't been there before. "Well, I hope you left some work for me," I said, attempting to keep the conversation light. Alex chuckled, his smirk deepening. "Plenty. You sure you're up for it?" I scoffed. "Please. I could still run circles around you." He arched an eyebrow, eyes gleaming with something I couldn't name. "We'll see about that." I swallowed, shifting my grip on my bag. "I should get settled in." "Go ahead." He jerked his chin toward the house. "I'll be out here." As I walked past him, heading toward the porch, I could feel his eyes on me, heavy and lingering. It made my breath hitch in a way I didn't understand, a way that had my heart pounding a little too fast. Something had changed. I just didn't know what. The evening settled over the farm in a golden haze, the sky streaked with pinks and oranges as the sun dipped below the horizon. After unpacking and freshening up, I made my way downstairs, drawn by the smell of something sizzling in the kitchen. Alex stood at the stove, barefoot and still shirtless, flipping steaks in a pan. A cold beer sat on the counter beside him, condensation beating on the glass. "You cook now?" I teased, leaning against the doorway. He glanced over his shoulder, his lips twitching. "Had to learn. You think Dad's any good in the kitchen?" I chuckled. "Good point." He plated the steak, sliding one in front of me as I sat down at the kitchen island. "Figured you'd be hungry." I took a bite, humming in appreciation. "Not bad." He smirked, taking a sip of his beer. High praise. The silence stretched between us, comfortable yet laced with something else. I could feel his gaze on me again, studying me in a way that made my stomach tighten. "You still in the city?" he asked after a moment. I nodded. "Yeah, work keeps me busy, but it's different out here. Quiet. That's why I love it." He leaned back in his chair, stretching out his legs, his gaze unwavering. "You always loved it here." Something in his voice made my pulse skip. I reached for my glass of water, tried to ignore the way my skin felt too warm. I needed to get a grip, but as the night deepened and the air grew thick with the scent of summer, I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had shifted, and that it was only the beginning. The air outside had cooled slightly, but the weight of the summer heat still clung to my skin as I stepped onto the porch after dinner. The wooden boards creaked under my bare feet, the scent of cut grass and warm earth drifting through the still night air. Fireflies blinked lazily in the distance, their golden flickers the only movement across the vast darkness of the fields. Alex was already out there, leaning against the railing, sipping from a fresh beer. He glanced at me as I approached, his gaze lingering longer than it should have. I settled onto the old porch swing, letting it sway gently beneath me as I exhaled. "I forgot how quiet it gets out here at night," I said. He smirked, taking another sip before resting the bottle against his thigh. "City too loud for you?" I shrugged. "It has its charm, but nothing beats this." I gestured to the open fields, the star-filled sky stretching endlessly overhead. "Everything just feels simple." Alex chuckled, shaking his head. "That's the trick of it. Looks simple, but the work never stops." I tilted my head toward him, studying his profile in the dim light. "You like it, don't you? The farm." His lips curled slightly, but he didn't look at me. "Yeah, he do." He exhaled, rubbing his palm along the back of his neck. "Thought about leaving a few times, but I guess this place gets in your blood." There was something in his voice, something deeper than just nostalgia, a weight, an unspoken tether keeping him bound here. I hesitated before asking, "Are you happy?" His eyes flickered toward me, then sharp and unreadable. The swing beneath me creaked as I shifted under his gaze. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low. "Maybe most days." I didn't know what to say to that. I wanted to reach for something comforting, something light to cut through the strange tension settling between us. But before I could speak, he leaned forward, resting his forearms against his knees. "Are you?" he asked. I blinked. "What? Happy?" he clarified, watching me intently. The question knocked the air from my lungs. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out at first. "Happy," I repeated. It should have been an easy question, but the fact that I had to think about it at all was telling. "I don't know," I admitted, trailing off and looking out toward the barn. The admission hung between us, heavy and unspoken. I felt him shift beside me, his fingers drumming idly against the glass bottle. "That's an answer, I guess," he said. Silence stretched between us again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt charged, like we were standing at the edge of something, neither of us having the courage to acknowledge it. The swing rocked slightly beneath me as I exhaled. "I should probably turn in soon," I said. Alex nodded, but I could feel him still watching me, his gaze a weight against my skin, something tangible even in the dim light. As I rose from the swing, he did the same. "I'll be up early," he murmured. "Work to do." I nodded, lingering a second too long before stepping back toward the house. But as I reached for the door, something stopped me, a hesitation, a feeling. I turned slightly, finding his eyes still on me, dark and steady. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally, I whispered, "Good night, Alex." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Night, Robert." I slipped inside, closing the door behind me. My heartbeat was a steady drum in my ears. But even as I climbed the stairs to my room, I knew I wouldn't sleep. Not after the way he looked at me. Not after the way I felt when I looked back. I mean, I knew something was coming, but I had never expected something this crazy. Because the story didn't end here. No, it had only just started, and the craziest part was yet to come. The next morning was already warm when I stepped outside. The sun was rising in hazy streaks of gold over the fields. Alex was already in the barn, shirtless again, working on a fence post near the entrance. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus as I approached. "Morning," I called out. He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. "Morning," he replied, glancing at the pile of tools nearby. "What's the plan for today?" "Fixing this section of the fence," he said, nodding toward the post. "Shouldn't take too long." I nodded, stepping closer. "I can help." A smirk pulled at his lips. "Think you can keep up?" I rolled my eyes, grabbing a pair of work gloves. "Try me." We worked side by side for the next hour. The sun climbed higher, the air growing thick with heat. Sweat dripped down my back, sticking my shirt to my skin. The scent of sawdust and warm earth filled my lungs as I hammered nails into the wooden planks. At one point, I glanced over at Alex, watching as he lifted another beam into place. His muscles flexed beneath his tan skin, his jaw tight with concentration. He caught me staring. I quickly looked away, heat crawling up my neck. "Something wrong?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. I cleared my throat, hammering another nail into place. "Just making sure you're doing it right." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you were." The easy banter helped. It made things feel normal, at least for a little while. But then it happened. I was reaching for another nail when I lost my balance slightly. My foot slipped against the uneven ground. Before I could catch myself, Alex's hand shot out, gripping my waist to steady me. It should have been nothing, a quick moment, a reflex, but his grip lingered. When I looked up at him, something passed between us. His fingers pressed against my side, firm yet cautious. His breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in slow, controlled movements. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The barn door creaked in the breeze, the only sound breaking the stillness. His thumb brushed against my hip, just slightly, just enough. I swallowed. My pulse hammered against my ribs. This was wrong, but I didn't step away. Neither did he. The air between us thickened, heavy with something unspoken, and I knew deep down that this wasn't just in my head. This was real, and it was only getting stronger. The moment stretched between us, thick and heavy like the summer air that clung to our skin. Alex's fingers, rough and calloused from years of farm work, still rested against my hip. His grip was firm, yet hesitant. I should have stepped back, should have broken whatever was passing between us, but I didn't. I couldn't. His breath was slow and measured, his chest rising and falling just inches from mine. I was hyper-aware of everything. The warmth of his touch, the way his thumb brushed my side absent-mindedly, the way his dark eyes held mine as if daring me to be the first to pull away. A breeze slipped through the barn, rustling the loose strands of my hair. It was the only thing that moved. I swallowed hard. "Alex," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw flexed. Yeah, I should have said something, anything that would snap us back to reality, but the words wouldn't come because, in that moment, reality didn't feel real. His fingers tightened slightly, just enough for me to feel the heat of his palm through the fabric of my shirt. My voice faltered. His gaze dipped just for a fraction of a second to my lips. My stomach clenched, a sudden rush of heat flooding through me. And that was when I panicked. I jerked back, breaking his hold. "We should get back to work," I blurted, forcing a breathless laugh. Alex didn't move right away. His eyes flicked over me, slow and assessing, as if he were trying to decide whether to push or let it go. Then finally, he exhaled and nodded. "Yeah, right." I turned sharply, grabbing another plank of wood from the pile, forcing my hands to stay steady, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. My thoughts were a tangled mess, my body betraying me in ways I didn't want to acknowledge. What the hell was happening to me? To us? The next hour passed in strained silence. The weight of what had just happened, or almost happened, hung between us like an invisible thread, pulling too tight. I focused on my work, refusing to let my mind wander, but Alex kept stealing glances at me. I could feel it. When we finally finished repairing the fence, I straightened, wiping the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. My tank top was damp, clinging to my skin, and my arms ached from the constant hammering. Alex tossed his hammer onto the workbench, stretching his arms over his head. The movement made his shirt lift slightly, revealing a sliver of toned stomach. I looked away quickly, my throat dry. "Want a break?" he asked. I nodded, too exhausted to argue. "Yeah, a break sounds good." We walked back toward the barn. The sun beat down on us, the air feeling heavier now, thicker. The tension between us lingered despite my best efforts to ignore it. Inside the barn was cooler. The shade offered some relief from the oppressive heat. I grabbed a water bottle from the work table, taking a long sip before leaning back against a wooden beam. Alex stood across from me, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes unreadable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence. "You felt it too, didn't you?" The question hit me like a punch to the gut. My fingers tightened around the water bottle. I shook my head. "I don't know what you're talking about." He let out a low chuckle, but there was no humor in it. "Come on, Robert. I'm not an idiot." I pressed my back against the beam, my pulse hammering. "Stan," I said, but he interrupted. "I see the way you look at me," he said, his voice quieter now. The way you react when I'm close. I swallowed hard, shaking my head. This isn't real, I said, because it sure as hell feels real to me. I opened my mouth to argue, but nothing came out because he was right. I hated it, but he was right. My silence only seemed to fuel him. His jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. Say it, he murmured. Say you don't feel it, and I'll drop it right here, right now. I stared at him, my throat dry, my body betraying me in ways I couldn't control. And that was the problem. I did feel it. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch, every second spent alone with him in this barn, I felt it. I was drowning in it. I tore my gaze away, looking anywhere but at him. I can't, I whispered. His breath hitched slightly, but he recovered quickly. You can't or you won't. I squeezed my eyes shut. It doesn't matter. It does, he said. I turned my head, meeting his gaze again. His expression had softened slightly. The intensity was still there, but laced with something else, something raw. We can't, I whispered, more to myself than to him. His lips pressed into a thin line, as if he were biting back a response. Then, after a moment, he exhaled and stepped back. For a second, I thought that was it, that he was letting it go. But then he spoke again. You're lying to yourself, he murmured. And then he walked away. I stood there, breathless, my entire body on edge, because deep down I knew he was right. I just wasn't ready to admit it yet. The rest of the day passed in a blur of unfinished thoughts and restless energy. I kept myself busy, throwing myself into every small chore I could find, anything to keep my mind occupied, anything to stop thinking about what had happened in the barn. But no matter how hard I tried, Alex's words kept circling back, looping in my head like an echo. You're lying to yourself. I hated that he was right. I hated that my body betrayed me every time he got close. By the time the sun had started dipping past the horizon, painting the sky in deep hues of purple and gold, I was exhausted. But not from work. I was exhausted from fighting something I wasn't sure I could resist much longer. And then, as if the universe was testing me, I saw him again. He was near the barn, standing just outside in the dimming light. The glow of a cigarette flickered in his hand every time he took a drag. I hadn't seen him smoke before. I hesitated for a moment, but then before I could talk myself out of it, I walked over. His eyes flicked up as I approached, unreadable in the fading light. He exhaled the smoke, curling lazily into the air before disappearing. Didn't know you smoked, I said, stopping a few feet away. I don't, he replied, flicking the cigarette onto the dirt and crushing it under his boot. Only when I got too much on my mind. I crossed my arms, shifting my weight slightly. And do you? I asked. He smirked, but there was something hollow in it. What do you think? The weight of his words pressed into my chest. I should have walked away. I should have let it go, but I didn't. Instead, I took a step closer. Alex, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. Say it, Robert, he said, his voice strained. Say what? I asked, my pulse thick and heavy in my throat. That you feel it too, he said. That I'm not imagining this. I felt my pulse in my throat, thick and heavy. I could have lied. Could have turned away and ended this before it went any further. But I didn't, because I couldn't. So instead, I whispered, you're not. His breath hitched. His entire body went still, like he was bracing himself. And then, in the next instant, he moved. He closed the space between us, so fast I barely had time to react. 1 second, I was standing there, lost in the weight of my own thoughts. The next, his hands were on me, gripping my hips, pulling me closer. I gasped, my fingers instinctively grabbing onto his arms. Tell me to stop, he murmured, his voice low and strained. I should have pushed him away. I should have told him to stop, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, my heart pounding, my breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls because I didn't want him to stop. I wanted him more than I had ever wanted anything. His fingers pressed into my skin, his grip firm but not forceful. His breath was warm against my cheek, and I could feel how tense he was, how hard he was holding himself back. And then, just as quickly as he had pulled me in, he let go. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. His breathing was uneven, Damn it, he muttered under his breath. I stared at him, my skin still burning where he had touched me. Alex, I said, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his expression raw and conflicted. I can't do this, Robert. Not unless I know you want it to. I swallowed. My heart was hammering. I wanted to say something, anything, but before I could, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in the dark, breathless, shaken, and completely unable to deny it anymore. Unknowingly of what was yet to come, I didn't sleep that night. Even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart refused to settle. My mind was a mess of tangled thoughts. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel him, his hands gripping my hips, the heat of his breath against my skin, the way he looked at me like he was barely holding himself back. I should have stopped it. I should have pushed him away, walked back to the house, and ended whatever was happening between us before it went any further. But I hadn't, and now I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. The sun was barely rising when I gave up on sleep and got dressed. My body felt restless, like something inside me was pacing, waiting, anticipating. I needed air. I needed to clear my head. I slipped outside. The cool morning breeze washed over me as I crossed the porch and headed toward the barn. But I wasn't alone. Alex was already there, leaning against the fence, his arms crossed, his jaw tight, as if he had been waiting, as if he had known I'd come. Our eyes met, and in that instant, everything that had been simmering between us boiled over. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just moved, and so did he. He met me halfway. His hands found my waist, pulling me to him like he couldn't bear another second of space between us. My fingers twisted in his shirt. My breath caught as his lips brushed against my ear. "Tell me you don't want this," he murmured, his voice rough with restraint. I couldn't because I did. More than anything, my grip tightened on him. My body pressed closer as I exhaled shakily. "I can't," I whispered, and that was all he needed. His mouth found mine, desperate and hungry. His hands pulled me against him like he was afraid I'd disappear. I melted into him, my fingers slipping into his hair, my body molding to his as the last of my resistance crumbled. The barn surrounded us, its walls shielding us from the world outside, making it feel like we were the only two people in existence. His lips trailed down my neck. Heat pooled in my stomach as he pressed me against the wooden beam behind me. His hands roamed, mapping the shape of me. His touch was both careful and demanding. "This is wrong," I breathed, even as I pulled him closer. He groaned against my skin, then stopped me. "I don't," I said, "because I don't want to, and neither do you." The world outside the barn faded, lost in the haze of breathless kisses and tangled limbs. There was no hesitation anymore, no second-guessing, just us. And for the first time since I arrived at the farm, I stopped fighting it. I let go. I let myself want him. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The heat between us deepened. Our bodies pressed together with an urgency neither of us could control. His hands roamed over me, exploring, learning. My breath hitched against his mouth. We moved with reckless abandon, lost in the haze of desire. The weight of hesitation crumbled beneath the undeniable pull between us. Every touch, every whispered breath, every shiver of skin against skin only fueled the fire that had been burning for far too long. There was no stopping it now, no turning back. We gave in completely, surrendering to the moment, to each other, until the world outside faded into nothing. Eventually, when we both had finished, we stayed quiet for a moment, both just realizing what had just happened. The barn was quiet now. The only sound was our heavy breathing mingling with the distant chirping of crickets outside. My back was pressed against the rough wooden beam. My fingers were still curled into Alex's shirt, as if letting go would unravel everything. His forehead rested against mine. His breath was warm and uneven. Neither of us spoke, maybe because there were no words big enough to fill the space between us. Maybe because we already knew that once we acknowledged what had just happened, there'd be no taking it back. Alex exhaled. His fingers flexed against my waist, holding me there like he wasn't ready to let me go. I started, my voice cracking barely above a whisper. I didn't even know what I was about to say. "I know," he murmured. That was the problem. He didn't know. We both did. And yet here we were. I swallowed hard, pressing my palms against his chest, but I didn't push him away. Instead, I just felt the steady drum of his heartbeat, the rise and fall of his breaths beneath my hands. His lips grazed my temple, slow and hesitant. A shiver raced through me at the way he said my name, like it was something sacred, something he didn't want to break. I should have pulled away, I said. I should have walked out of that barn, out of your arms, out of this moment before it swallowed me whole. But I didn't. Instead, I let my fingers drift up, tracing the curve of his jaw, memorizing the heat of his skin, the way his muscles tensed under my touch. I don't know how to stop, I admitted. His breath hitched, and for a second, I thought he might say something final, something that would bring me back to my senses. But he didn't. Instead, he kissed me again, slower this time, softer, like he wanted to make sure I understood. I did. God, I did. I felt it in the way his hand slid up my back, pulling me closer, in the way his lips moved against mine, coaxing, tasting. In the way every nerve in my body lit up the moment he touched me. It wasn't just attraction. It was something deeper, something dangerous, something we weren't ready to name. And yet neither of us stopped. Not when his hands wandered, exploring, learning. Not when my breath caught, my fingers tightening against him. Not when the last shred of hesitation melted between us. Time became irrelevant, slipping away unnoticed as we lost ourselves in each other. And for those moments, the world outside the barn didn't exist. No past, no future, just this, just us. But reality had a cruel way of creeping back in. A noise outside, a car engine rumbling up the driveway, made me tense instantly. My body jolted back to awareness. Alex cursed under his breath. His grip on me tightened for just a second before he reluctantly let go. The moment shattered. I stumbled back, my breath still uneven as I smoothed down my shirt, trying to collect myself. His parents were home. The weight of what had just happened slammed into me all at once. I looked at Alex, my heart pounding. And for the first time, I saw in his eyes, too, the realization, the understanding that we had just crossed a line we could never uncross. The door to the farmhouse slammed shut in the distance. Voices carried toward the barn. Panic surged through me. "Alex," I said. I know," he muttered, raking a hand through his hair. His jaw was clenched. I took a shaky breath, forcing myself to move. "We can't," I said. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and unreadable. "Don't say it, Alex," I said. "Don't," he repeated, his voice quiet but firm. "Not now." I swallowed hard, glancing toward the barn doors, then back at him. My pulse was a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. Footsteps approached the barn. "We'll talk later," he murmured. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure what there was left to say because we both knew the truth. What happened in that barn changed everything. And no matter how hard we tried, we could never go back. A couple of hours later, the barn door creaked open slightly, just enough for a sliver of golden porch light to spill inside. My breath caught in my throat. My heart slammed against my ribs as Alex, and I stood frozen in place. His parents were back. His mother's voice rang out, casual and unsuspecting. "Alex, you out here?" I could feel his tension, see the way his hands curled into fists at his sides, his breathing too controlled. He didn't move right away. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes flicked to mine, holding me there as if he was memorizing the moment before it was lost to reality. Then finally, he exhaled and turned toward the door. "Yeah, Mom, just finishing up some work." His voice was steady, casual, too casual. I watched as he ran a hand through his hair, trying to fix himself, trying to shake off what had just happened between us. I did the same, smoothing my shirt, wiping at the sweat on my neck, hoping, praying that nothing looked amiss. But my lips still tingled from his kiss. My skin still burned where he had touched me, and no amount of smoothing could fix what had already been done. His mother lingered for a second, then sighed. "Well, don't be out too late. We just got home, and I want to hear how things have been while we were gone." "I'll be in soon," Alex said. The door creaked shut, leaving us in silence once more. Only this time, the moment was different. We weren't wrapped up in heat and reckless abandon. We were caught in the gravity of what had just happened. I swallowed hard. My throat was tight. "Alex," I tried again. "I know," he muttered, shaking his head. He wasn't looking at me anymore. Something in my chest twisted. I felt like I was losing my grip on something that had just barely begun. "We should talk," I said. He let out a short, humorless chuckle. "Talk about what, Robert? That we just crossed a line we can't come back from? That no matter what we say, no matter what we feel, this is..." He exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "This is messed up." I flinched at his words. Something sharp cut through me. "So now you regret it?" His eyes snapped to mine, dark and stormy. "No," he said immediately, his voice rough. "I don't." The air crackled between us, thick with all the things we weren't saying. I want to tell him that I didn't regret it either, that it had felt more real, more right than anything I'd felt in a long time. But I couldn't say it, because if I did, if I admitted it, it would make everything that much harder. So instead, I whispered, "Then what do we do now?" Alex looked at me, his jaw tight. "I don't know." And that terrified me more than anything else, because things didn't go back to normal. I mean, how could they? I tried at first. I tried pretending nothing had changed, that what happened in the barn was just a moment, a mistake we could erase if we ignore it hard enough. But the tension was there. It was in the way Alex avoided being alone with me, in the way he barely looked at me when his parents were around. It was in the stolen glance when we crossed paths, in the electric silence when we were forced into the same space. I thought it would get easier. It didn't. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression unreadable. I'd hear the way his breath hitched when I brushed too close, even accidentally. And at night, when the house was quiet and I was alone in my room, I'd lie awake, replaying every moment in the barn, the way he felt, the way he tasted. It was torture, but the worst part was that I wanted him to break. I wanted him to pull me aside, to say screw it, to kiss me again and pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. But he didn't. He kept his distance, and it was driving me insane. But 3 nights later, I found him outside, standing by the fence, staring out at the dark fields. It was late, past midnight, but I had given up on sleep hours ago. I hesitated in the doorway, watching him, debating whether I should just turn back. But I couldn't, so I stepped outside. He stiffened slightly but didn't turn, didn't acknowledge me at first. I swallowed hard. "Couldn't sleep?" I said. His jaw tightened. No, the tension stretched, unbearable. I shifted on my feet. Are we really just going to act like nothing happened? His head dropped slightly. His fingers tightened around the fence post. Finally, he turned. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, God, his eyes were a storm. "I don't want to act like nothing happened," he admitted, his voice rough. "But I don't know how to do this, Robert." I stepped closer, then stopped. Then stopped thinking about it so much. "Just tell me the truth." His throat bobbed as he swallowed. And then finally, he whispered, "I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I go to bed, and all I can see is you. I wake up, and you're the first thing on my mind. And every damn time I look at you, He let out a ragged breath, shaking his head. "I just want you." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because they mirrored mine exactly. I stepped closer, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Then why are we fighting it?" His eyes burned into mine. "Because this isn't just about what we want." I swallowed hard. My pulse pounded. "We're not hurting anyone," I whispered. His jaw flexed. "Not yet." That was the difference between us. I was willing to jump off the edge to see where we landed, but he was still standing at the cliff, terrified of the fall. I reached out. My fingers grazed his. Alex's breath hitched for a second. I thought he might kiss me again. For a second, I thought he might finally let go. But then he stepped back, and just like that, the space between us became unbearable. "We can't," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I sucked in a shaky breath, nodding even though everything inside me screamed in protest. This was it, the moment we chose. And he was choosing to let me go. Tears burned in my throat, but I refused to let them fall. "Okay," I whispered. I turned and walked away before he could see me break, before I could change my mind, before he could change his. But as I climbed the stairs to my room, as I closed the door and pressed my back against it, my chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, I knew this wasn't over. It could never be over because Alex and I weren't just a mistake. We were inevitable, or at least that's how I see it. But I'm curious. How do you think of it? Please let me know your thoughts on all this in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this emotional and heart-wrenching story. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button for more touching LGBT stories. And as always, feel free to share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. Until next time, take care and keep supporting love in all its forms.